It's very easy to put the blame on human resources. But actually, what we find is human resources professionals, many of them, they see what needs to be done. They see a different kind of organization, but they are prevented from actually creating that kind of organization because the power lies within the chief executive and the exec coach as a whole, which are not focused on organizational issues. They're not systemic thinkers. So a big part of this is how do we educate the entire corporate system to think more systemically? And I think that's probably the biggest shift in expectation and role of HR that has to come. They must become the educators of the organization so that the system becomes transparent to those who have the influence to make it different.
Welcome to the Systemic Talent Management Podcast.
When it came to naming this podcast, there really wasn't much of a discussion. The name was obvious, the Systemic Talent Management Podcast. Not because it's the most catchy name in the world, I think we can all agree it's not, but it best describes what this podcast is about. To close the gap between the linear models most organizations are still running on and the complex, deeply human reality of how work actually happens. A gap that can only be closed through a systemic lens. I'm Riddhika Khoosal, and here's my co-host, Professor David Clutterbuck.
Thank you, Riddhika. You know, I've spent 50 years asking organizations one very uncomfortable question. If succession planning and talent management and all of the paraphernalia around it actually work, how come the wrong people so often get to the top? And the honest answer, more often than not, is that the systems that most organizations are running weren't really built for the complexity of human beings. The research has been there for decades, the evidence has been there, and yet the default settings keep reasserting themselves. This podcast is our attempt to do something about that. We're not going to offer tidy answers, there aren't very many of those, but by bringing together the people who are genuinely thinking differently about work, about talent, and about what organizations could look like if only we built them around how human beings actually function. For HR professionals, for leaders, for anyone navigating the future of work and sensing that the old playbook just doesn't work enough anymore, this is for you. This is the Systemic Talent Management Podcast, and I think we're going to have a very good, fun time pursuing these ideas.
I agree with you, David. I'm really excited to be here and on this journey with you. And I want to take this opportunity to introduce you, David, to the audience, Professor David Clutterbuck. So David is quite simply one of the most consequential figures in the history of coaching and mentoring. He introduced supported mentoring to Europe in the early 1980s, a concept most organizations now take for granted. He is one of the original pioneers who helped shape the field into the profession it is today. And he is the co-founder of the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, commonly known as the EMCC, the first professional body of its kind. He's a visiting professor at Henley Business School and has authored more than 75 books on coaching, mentoring, team dynamics, governance, leadership, talent management, and even children's fiction. His book, The Talent Wave, quite literally kick-started the systemic talent management movement. And his current work, he's exploring AI in coaching, how to build teams of teams, and a project to develop 5 million young coaches around the world. David, welcome to our podcast. The privilege is genuinely mine.
Thank you, Riddhika. And let me tell our listeners a little bit about the person I'm lucky enough to be doing this podcast with. Riddhika Khoosal is a globally recognized organizational development consultant, a facilitator, and a leadership and team coach. For over a decade, she's partnered with Fortune 500 companies to transform leadership, strengthen team effectiveness, and drive what she calls sustainable human high performance. She brings to this podcast something that's genuinely rare, the ability to hold both the conceptual and the deeply practical at the same time. Where I tend to ask the difficult questions, Riddhika helps people and organizations actually do something with the answers. She's also a co-author with me on work around navigating political environments in organizations, which tells you she's not afraid of complexity. Riddhika, I know that we're going to have a lot of fun together.
Let's dive in, David.
Absolutely.
David, you've been in this field for over 50 years. What is one thing that still frustrates you most about how organizations manage talent?
Think the thing that I find astounding is just how much of what HR does in talent management and succession planning is actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. It's linear thinking in a world which is increasingly complex. The kind of issues that organizations face are no longer just complicated, they're not even complex. They live somewhere between complexity and chaos. And we need to have adaptable solutions that actually use the talent within an organization. And whatever we look at, whether it's diversity and inclusion, whether it's how do you actually develop the talent of people so that they're into particular roles, how you retain people. The practices that we see within HR are all too often based upon assumptions that have no significant evidence beneath them.
So it sounds like we've been moving in a direction, not really looking around and asking questions about how we adapt and respond to what's really happening around us.
Absolutely. What we've got is a culture of quick fixes, and quick fixes don't solve problems for long term. They actually make problems. So why do companies struggle to retain people? Because they don't create environments where people can grow into new roles that really suit them and benefit the organization at the same time. Why do we have so many problems with ethics in organizations? Because the systems of promotion actually favor the sociopath.
So this shift that you're talking about, this movement away from linear thinking and processes and systems within HR and evolving into a more systemic approach is really important for those of our listeners who are still struggling to understand what we mean by systemic. Could you help walk us through the issue with linear, maybe an example of linear, and how systemic thinking is actually what is needed and will really change the game?
Well, let me give a humorous example. I think a humorous example, because I think we have to approach all this with humor as well, so that we get insight. One of the issues that we've identified in our work on teams of teams is that organizations are primarily constructed on vertical communications. And yet what we're looking for is collaboration across the organization, which relies on horizontal communications. But these things, all the systems are set up to reward individuals rather than teams. Or if you reward the team, then the team focuses on its KPIs and what it achieves, but not on how it's helping other teams to achieve. So some of the simple things that we've been able to introduce are making part of the way that we measure each team's performance, how other teams perceive it's helped them. And if we want to have some fun with this, we've been taking a group of teams which are interdependent within an organization, and then each team creates a strategy for how it will make life more difficult for the other teams. And then the teams share these strategies, and it's a lot of laughter and so forth. But then somebody says, but you do that. And so what we're trying to do is to help the system see itself. And that, for me, is one of the biggest roles for HR in the future. We're helping the system to become more transparent, because if we can actually work at a systems level, not an individual level or a team level, we've actually got a better chance of creating sustainable, high-performing organizations.
So this shift, David, from linear to systemic, the theory is there. You've given a beautiful example of how it can be brought to life. In your experience, what's really stopping HR or HR professionals from really making this shift rapidly? We know about it, but how often are we really seeing it?
It's very easy to put the blame on human resources. But actually, what we find is in human resources professionals, many of them They see what needs to be done. They see a different kind of organization, but they are prevented from actually creating that kind of organization because the power lies within the chief executive and the exec and the exec coke as a whole, which are not focused on organizational issues. They're not systemic thinkers. So a big part of this is how do we educate the entire corporate system to think more systemically? And I think that's probably the biggest shift in expectation and role of HR that has to come. They must become the educators of the organization so that the system becomes transparent to those who have the influence to make it different.
And this conversation, it feels really important right now, especially in the current age we're living in and with all the disruption that we're seeing with AI also entering the workplace and the world at large. In your opinion, why should this be a top priority?
If we don't work with the systems in organizations, AI is going to potentially do a lot of harm. Because AI actually is a linear thinking approach. It may look very systemic in the sense that it gathers information from all sorts of places, but it's going to be basing things on algorithms which are relatively fixed. Whereas in a truly vital organization, we are changing the algorithms all the time. We're responding to things that are happening around us. So it's the capacity of an organization to evolve rapidly and be agile in the face of all the changes that AI is initiating and geopolitics and other pressures are creating. That flexibility, that agility requires us to understand the system, because if you just react instinctively to one bit of the system, you end up with a completely different result than what you intended, and you may you may miss the biggest threats that are lying just around the corner because the system has a way of hitting back.
What advice would you give leaders, HR professionals, or anyone who is really interested in being able to support the shift into more systemic ways of working, given the current challenges and climate we currently find ourselves in?
Well, 2 or 3 years ago, we did a study for the conference board, and we asked HR directors in Europe to talk about the biggest challenges they had in terms of post-COVID leadership. And one of the things that came out of that study that was, I think, very significant was that most of them believed that a significant proportion of their executives, their top 200 or 300 people in the organization, were technically obsolete because they couldn't let go of command and control, and they could not think systemically. And therefore, they were unable to react. So they spent more and more of their time trying to control more and more and achieving less and less. When in a complex adaptive system, we're not trying to control, we're trying to flow with things and actually find the paths of least resistance. And so the need to educate leaders, maybe even replace leaders who are intellectually not capable of thinking systemically. This, I think, is a big challenge. It's one where coaches can help. But I think it's also one where what we're looking at, the competencies frameworks that we have, for example, which have big problems of their own, as we'll investigate as we go into this series. But how do we actually identify who is capable at a senior level in an organization of riding the waves of change?
David, it's already been a really interesting discussion and entry into the conversation of systemic thinking. Is there anything else you want to say to our audience about this podcast and what we're really hoping to do?
What we've tried to do in this series is bring together people who really have looked at one or more aspects of this very complex puzzle and who have taken an evidence-based approach. So much of HR practice is based upon assumptions that have never been tested. And so what does the evidence say? So we hope to provide a unique insight into the way that human systems at work really do function.
Thank you, David. And if you're a HR professional, a leader, or simply someone who believes that organizations can be more human, more adaptive, and more alive, this podcast is for you. Subscribe wherever you listen or share it with someone who you might find this conversation interesting. And if something we say provokes a thought or a question or a challenge, we genuinely want to hear it and we invite your voice in the room. Thanks so much for your time today, David. It's been such an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Riddhika. And in our next episode, we'll be diving straight in. We'll be exploring what systemic thinking actually means for talent management in practice and why so much of what passes for strategic HR still isn't really systemic at all. We might ruffle a few feathers on the way.
Good. We'll see you there.